All right, so on Sunday, we were looking at the book of Revelation. And we looked at one particular image in chapter 19, a really critical image where we see the rider on the white horse. And it's Jesus come with a weapon, a sword that comes from his mouth, with his robe dipped in blood to defeat the armies of evil. And a lot of people see this, and what they see here is a violent Jesus on the warpath, very unlike the Jesus we know from the Gospels, but a Jesus who is now going to right the wrongs of the world. Except that's not quite the image we're seeing. Absolutely, this is Jesus about to right the wrongs of the world, but it is not through violence. It's actually through the sacrifice that we saw in the Gospels. Jesus' robe is dipped in blood. This is before the battle. This is because this is Jesus' blood. This is Jesus' sacrifice. And his weapon is the sword that comes from his mouth, because his weapon is his testimony, his non-violent sacrifice and death. This is what defeats evil. In fact, it's a subversion of an image that we get from Isaiah, the day of the Lord's vengeance, where there we see an image of God on the warpath covered in blood. Now, in the full revelation of the Christ, what we see is that actually it was always God's sacrifice, it was always God's willingness to give God's self to us that wins the day. Now, people will ask, well, why then does Revelation present this in such an obscure way? Why do you have to read the images so closely to understand them? You kind of have to do a close line-by-line reading to really understand the images. Well, to understand that, we have to understand why Revelation was written in the first place. So Revelation is written late in the first century as localized, sporadic persecution of Christianity is emerging in the Roman Empire. At this time, we are not talking about widespread systematic persecution. That's not happening under the reign of Domitian in the late first century, but there was sporadic, localized persecution. You even see this in the letters to Revelation. Some of the cities are doing well, they're prospering, they are wealthy and comfortable. Some of them are facing a lot of heat and a lot of pain and a lot of persecution from the communities around them. But God is speaking into all of this, and what God is saying is that all of this will one day come to an end. All pain, all suffering, all persecution, all mistreatment of those who are on the downside of the power equation, all of this will be healed. And the way that it does that is by saying that Jesus has already overcome evil, already overcome the principalities and powers of the world. But if you're expecting God to overcome the power of Rome, you're probably expecting God to do that in the way of Rome. Rome brings the Pax Romana at the point of a sword. Perhaps God will bring the kingdom at the point of a divine sword. And so what Revelation does is it builds your expectation, it leans into what you might think to expect, and then it subverts it. And we see this all throughout the narrative of Revelation. Chapter 4, we're introduced to the Lion of the tribe of Judah. He roars and we turn expecting to see God in a warrior pose. Instead, what John sees is a lamb looking as if it had been slain. So we get this juxtaposition of what we hear and what we expect, and what we turn to see is the sacrifice of Christ. Later, we get the victory over the great red dragon, Satan, who wages war against the armies of heaven. But what we hear is that Satan was overcome by the testimony of the martyrs. They refuse to fight back. They tell their story of sacrifice, and Satan is sent down from heaven to the earth to try to find somewhere else to pick a fight. In fact, when we don't return violence with violence, then the adversary has nothing to play off of, and the adversary simply has to leave and go to find someone else to goad into battle. This is how Satan is overcome. And then in the climactic battle, as the armies of heaven meet the armies of evil, here we see Christ, his robe dipped in his own blood, his only weapon, his testimony of nonviolence and faithfulness to God. And even in this moment, the armies of evil are overcome without incident, without battle. And every time in Revelation, what the author is doing is building up to your expectation what you have been trained by the world to think about God and victory and conquest. Only at the last moment, only when you think you've totally bought into the narrative, to pull the rug out from under you and show you what the divine is really like. And the reason for this is because when certain ideas become so deeply ingrained into our psyche that they begin to feel like common sense, like this is the only obvious way for things to happen, what we need sometimes is a shock to the system, a jolt. We need something to wake us up out of our apathy and our ignorance to see the world with completely new eyes. In Jesus' teaching in the Gospels, one of the metaphors he uses for this is to be born again, to see the world with completely new eyes, as if all of the stories and the limitations that have closed down your imagination are gone. The blinders are off and you can see things for the very first time as if you were born again. That's what Revelation is trying to do. It's trying to build you to the moment where you think you know what is happening, then to pull the rug out from you and hope that in that moment, the blinders come off and you see things as if for the very first time. It's an incredibly powerful way of illustrating things because it goes not only to who God really is and what God is really like, but it speaks to the presuppositions that we have already made about how the world works. Revelation is saying everything is different than you imagine. Everything is better than you can believe. God is bigger, more graceful, more loving, and God is going to change the world one small, non-violent sacrifice and victory at a time. And we now get to participate in that by working toward justice with non-violent direct action that calls out the injustices of the world, that points towards something better, that puts ourselves on the line for what is good and true and holy, but refuses to fight fire with fire, refuses to fight violence with violence. This is what the writer of Revelation is communicating to us. He is showing us an image of Jesus that is completely consistent with the Jesus we met in the Gospels.